Hello. If you've been following my talks over the last several months, you know that I've been talking about the concept of time and Buddhist practice. First, I gave a talk about sort of a general overview of time, and especially about how the views of modern physics aligns in some respects with the founder of Soto Zen, Dogen, and his fascicle Uji, or being time. Next, I talked about the idea of the past. Now that's aligned with basic Buddhist ideas about interconnection, conditioning, causation, and karma. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about what has not happened yet. I'm going to be talking about the future. First, we're going to look at the Four Noble Truths, which are the first foundational teachings of the Buddha, and how craving, grasping, and clinging are rooted in our ideas about the future and about avoiding the pitfalls that arise when we attach to ideas about the future. Then I'm going to talk about the Eightfold Path and specifically about right effort. And I'm going to talk about the paramitas, which are generosity, morality, patience, vigor, concentration, and wisdom, and their relationship to the cultivation of practice. Then I'm going to be returning to the Western views of physics and philosophy about the future, and specifically about determinism and free will, in contrast to Buddhist ideas about non-self, emptiness, and interconnectedness. Then if there's time at the end, I'm going to share a little guided meditation with you that's going to be leading up to my last talk on the subject of time, which will be about the present moment. First up, I'm going to read through the Four Noble Truths as they first appear in the Pali Canon, which is the historical textual basis for Buddhism. So the Buddha says, "Now this, bhikkhus," and this is a word that means monks, "this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of suffering." And there are many ways of understanding this word, which in the original is the word dukkha, but it's generally thought of now as having more to do with dissatisfaction than with physical pain, although that's a part of it too. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, and I want to emphasize this last part. Union with what is displeasing is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the five aggregates, which are the Buddhist way of describing the constantly changing parts of our awareness that make up our experience of consciousness. So the five aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. And I've heard this sort of simplified as being wanting what you don't have, having what you don't want, and clinging to things which are impermanent. That's the first noble truth. The second noble truth is, now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. It is craving which leads to rebecoming, accompanied by delight and lust. Seeking delight here and there, that is, and I'm going to emphasize this again, craving for sensual pleasure, craving for becoming, craving for disbecoming. So wanting pleasure to happen, wanting certain things to happen and certain other things to not happen. The third noble truth. Now, this bhikkhus is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. Is the remainderless fading away and cessation of craving, the giving up and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, non-reliance on it. So in other words, you can overcome it. It can be overcome. The fourth noble truth. Now, this bhikkhus is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. It is this noble eightfold path. That is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and most importantly for us in this talk, right effort, then right mindfulness and right concentration. So let's look at these key words. All of these reference the future. Wanting and or craving. Wanting is not about what is, right? It's not about the present. It's about something that will take place, not something that is taking place. But here's a conundrum for you. A verbal snake eating its own tail. I want to stop wanting. Of course, wanting that is itself wanting. So we're right back where we started from. There's a teaching story, which I think is from the Pali Canon. The Buddha says to a group of monks, go into the forest and meditate until you've eliminated all desire. So they go off and do that and come back many months later and say, we've succeeded in eliminating all desire. And the Buddha says, oh, good, good. Now eliminate your desire to eliminate desire. Craving and wanting are what cultivates attachment to an outcome in the future. If you really, truly, deeply want something, and I don't know what that might be, a Ferrari, a new lover, a great job, some kind of fantastic success, I don't know, it goes on and on. It's going to be really, truly suffering if it doesn't happen. And that's the danger we're being steered away from. An attachment to an outcome. If you think about the paradoxical vows of a bodhisattva, vowing to free all beings when beings are numberless, or if you prefer the Diamond Sutra, when there are no beings to free. This is pointing towards this truth. It's saying that if I just do the best I can without attachment to any outcome, because these things are impossible, the dissatisfaction with it is short-circuited. Beings are numberless, but I vow to free them anyway. I bet the word grasping. For me, this is a verb. It brings to mind an action. It's the activity of wanting and craving. What's going on in your head? The work your mind does as a result of wanting and craving. It reminds me of a kind of momentum. I get that kind of feeling from it. It's momentum with a sense of longing at the same time. Or the word clinging. This word in this context has a special relationship to the idea of impermanence. Mental clinging is like a kind of unrealistic assumption that what we have, ideas, a sense of self, objects, loved ones, and on, are somehow permanent, will always exist as they are forever. This is such an easy assumption to make, and such a painful trap to fall into unaware. Since everything, literally everything, is constantly changing. From my taste in music, to the car I drive, to the government I rely on, my friends and family, my own body, subject to old age, sickness, and death. The more tightly my mind clings to these ideas as permanent, as belonging to me, as existing as they are far into the future, the more painful and disappointing their loss will be. Hopes and fears. Hopes and fears are related to the future. It's good to have hopes. It's good to make plans. It's good to work towards goals, to strive for a better world. We have to do that here in the conventional world. We have to do this cautiously. You just have to do the best you can right now, without being certain of how it will turn out. We really need to have a strong sense of what is most likely to result in a more beneficial future. And then we need to just do those things now, regardless of whether those things come to pass. It's really a kind of courage that we cultivate through the Eightfold Path. Fear and worry and anxiety crop up when I begin to fall into the trap of what could be, what should be. What could happen in the future, what should happen in the future. Rather being content with what I'm doing now to make the future better. Worry equals what could happen, what should happen. Peace equals what am I doing now to make things happen? And it means just doing the best you can right now. And however much that might be, maybe just a little, maybe a lot. Just stay here with what you're doing now, not in the unknowable fog of the future. The Eightfold Path and the Paramitas are a guide to how to proceed. If you need help figuring out what the best course of action is right now, these are some of the best indicators of what will be most beneficial. I think it was Shinryu Suzuki who said there are no enlightened people. It's only enlightened action. The Eightfold Path sets out how to act right now for our benefit in the future. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration all occur now. And they cultivate benefit in the future. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha explains right effort, saying, what is right effort? Here the monk arouses his will, puts forth effort, generates energy, exerts his mind, and strives to maintain wholesome mental states that have already arisen, to keep them free of delusion, to develop, increase, cultivate, and perfect them. So once again, effort happens now. Just doing the best you can. Development, increase, cultivation are things that happen later. As far as perfection goes, I don't know about that. I'm just going to pass that up for now. At any rate, the practice is aimed at the future, but it exists right now. So I just learned a saying this past practice period about the paramitas, which are the perfections of practice for bodhisattvas. It goes like this: generosity, morality, patience, vigor, concentration, and wisdom are both the cause and the result of liberation. And I think this is true of the Eightfold Path as well. So let's try that on for size. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration are both the cause and the result of liberation. We live here in the present with the cause, not in the future with the result. The result is none of our business. So it's a pretty good thing that they're the same thing, right? Now I'm going to switch to something a bit different. I'm going to be contrasting and comparing modern science and Western philosophical ideas with Buddhist ideas of the future. Specifically, I want to briefly talk about determinism and freedom of will. In an earlier talk, I explained how in modern physics, the dimensions of space and time can be, as a thought experiment, sort of viewed from the outside, which is sort of a block. It's like one thing, kind of like a loaf of bread that's sliced. And this is referred to as the view from nowhere. And if you think about this,
Matt?
Yes.
I didn't quite hear you. The view from where?
Know when. So if you look at all of existence as being like a loaf of bread, each slice is like one instant of everything. And if you look at it from this viewpoint, you can see how all of existence is sort of frozen in this idea. Each slice of the block representing an instant, there's no possibility of any kind of variance from one instance to the next instance. Or weirdly enough, in science, they've determined that there's no way that you can have any difference between the instant happening now and the one that came before it. It's all set in stone. In Western philosophy, there's the debated topic of free will. What this is does what I do make a difference in the future? Or is it all already set? Free will assumes that my actions and choices have a moral and ethical weight that carries forward. It causes other things to occur. Determinism is the idea that everything is already set Nothing you can do will change anything. This is a kind of logical nihilism. But even in science, there's a way out. In quantum physics, there's an idea about indeterminacy called the multi-universe theory. You may have heard of this. The idea is that either everything that can possibly happen does happen, but in another universe, or that I choose which universe I inhabit by making a choice which splits off. So choose one way and nothing happens. Choose another way and something does happen. And this would mean that I'm literally altering the course of the universe around me as I move through time, making choices. This is in some ways connected to the idea that a phenomena, something happening, can't be separated from the observation of the phenomena. So on occasion, I've had a chance to talk to very seasoned Buddhist teachers about this idea of free will and choice and nihilism and determinism and stuff, and because it's this is a big deal in Western philosophy. But it's always been strange to me that usually they seem to just kind of brush it off and say, so I really don't understand what the big deal is about that. I found this really puzzling. So I went doing some research on the internet, and after a long, arduous trek in the internet, I found this scholarly paper called Buddhism and the Freedom of the Will, Pali and Mahayanist Responses. It's by two professors of philosophy and comparative religion, Nicholas F. Geer and Paul Kelberg. And this finally gave me a satisfactory explanation of what might be going on here. So it turns out that the reason Buddhism and the vast library of Buddhist philosophy doesn't touch on this subject of free will is really pretty simple. The Western viewpoint is leaning very heavily on the idea of a self, or in religion, the idea of a soul. As Geer and Kelberg put it, suffering is caused by a belief in a self that does not exist. Thinking in terms of a self that is enduring, separate, and independent causes people to search for a happiness that they cannot find, precisely because such a self does not exist. In other words, freedom of will is not a problem in Buddhism because there's no self to have a will. And if you've been deeply internalizing and actualizing this philosophy, this whole problem becomes a moot point. So this is extremely important in regards to a Buddhist view of the future. As I've pointed out, we're instructed to simply follow the path that is most likely to be of benefit to all beings. There's no self or soul in there at all. As Geer and Kelberg put it, in the Mahayana tradition, one would not be able to simply alleviate one's own suffering without relying on the notion of a self that caused the suffering in the first place. As a result, motivation must come from the desire to alleviate the suffering of all sentient beings. It's this realization that led to the Bodhisattva ideal. So in our tradition, falling into nihilism is a kind of trap set by our own desire to cling to a self. Causation is highly emphasized in Buddhism, and we have a choice to make. As Geer and Kelberg write, the basic Buddhist moral law can be conceived of as the truth that all actions have consequences. If we act motivated by greed, hatred, or delusion, we're planting the seed of suffering. When our acts are motivated by generosity, love, or wisdom, these are all paramitas, then we're creating the conditions for abundance and happiness. So make the choices that have the best chance of making things better. So I've been talking about the future and its relationship to Buddhist practice. I talked about the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and the paramitas and how they're activities that take place now, cultivating good outcomes in the future, and the dangers of becoming attached to future outcomes, and how our practice now is both the cause and the result of practice. I talked about wanting and craving for outcomes in the future and grasping and clinging to things which are impermanent, and how these ideas trap us in a cycle of disappointment. I talked about right effort, and doing the best you can right now. And I discussed the ideas of free will and determinism and how they contrast with the Buddhist idea of no self, and how the important idea of causation connects us to the choices we make for the future. And that science has theorized that the choices we make might possibly influence the reality we inhabit. That's a big responsibility to have. The Eightfold Path and the paramitas are a great guide to making beneficial choices and not falling into nihilism. And I see that I'm about out of time, so I'm not going to be able to get to this meditation. Probably save that for next time. But I think that's what I want to say. And I'm going to stop recording here, and we open up for discussion.